on the language and structure question that you will be familiar with in both the paper 1 fiction paper and paper 2 non-fiction and transactional writing paper in GCSE English language. Now, for the purposes of today's video, I'm going to be focusing on the fiction paper, the 6-mark language and structure question. Regardless of whichever one you're working on, both of them will be what I like to call a how question. And in the how question, there are always 3 things that you need to bear in mind. A how question is going to always ask you to analyze language choices. And it's going to ask you to say something about structure. And it's also going to ask you to use your knowledge of subject terminology. Now, when we're thinking about language choices, the temptation is to say, well, okay, I'm going to focus on a particular word and I'm going to explain the writer's choice of that word. So here's one I prepared earlier. So that might be the sort of thing that you might say. The writer's use of the word uneasily shows. Now, there's nothing really wrong with that. You're focusing on a particular word and you're going to be explaining what it means. But if we're thinking about language choices, then we can improve that slightly. We can say the writer's choice of the adverb uneasily suggests. So there is a subtle difference between saying the writer's use of the word and the writer's choice of the word, and it is all about that sophistication in your expression. Adverb is obviously subject terminology, so you're showing your understanding of that key skill that is being tested in a language and structure question. And then saying suggests instead of shows, again, it just goes down to the level of sophistication that we are looking for in a piece of writing. So I tend to say, avoid this shows, this shows, this shows. Try and be a bit more sophisticated in your expression and talk about this suggests, this implies, and so on. Now, the language analysis in many ways is something that a lot of you are quite good at doing, but when it comes to structure, writing about structure and knowing what to say sometimes can be a little bit confusing. So obviously when you're writing about structure, you are going to want to probably look at sentence structure. So that might well be rhetorical devices like rhetorical questions, the use of the tricolon or the list of 3, things like that. Or you might want to comment on the variety of sentence structure, for example, short sentences for impact and effect. Or you might want to talk about long descriptive sentences, like the ones that you may have studied in class if you looked at an extract from Great Expectations, for example, where Dickens adds layer upon layer of detail using the repetition of the word and. That's a structural device, long descriptive sentences to create a mood or an atmosphere. The repetition, use of anaphora, if a word or phrase is repeated in successive lines of a speech, you'll be familiar with that in the famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. So there's quite a lot you can say about sentence structure that you'll be familiar with. But another aspect of structure that you can write about, and it's something that sometimes students forget, is that you can actually talk about changes in mood or atmosphere. Oops, good job I've got a friction pen, isn't it? There we go. Mood, atmosphere, emotion, etc. But in terms of structure, it's all about the way those things change. So being able to comment on the mood at the beginning of the extract compared to how it's different at the end, and so on. That's what it's about. It's about the progression and the change. So again, some of you might remember studying that there was an extract that we have in school from Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge, where you can see the mood changing very, very clearly from the beginning of the extract to the end. So don't forget those elements that you can talk about when you're talking about a how question. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at one of the practice papers from SharePoint that you can use yourself, and some of you may have looked at these in class. So this is the section of SharePoint, and this is the practice paper that I'm going to focus on in this video. So it's the fiction paper, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime by Oscar Wilde. There's the paper, and there's the mark scheme that you can look at for yourselves. And so let me just bring up the paper here. There we go. So with any exam paper where you've got a text that they print on the page and they're going to ask you a question about, the temptation is to spend some time reading through the extract first, then look at the questions and then begin your answer. I would suggest actually, before you look closely at the extract, I would suggest you look at the question first. Interact with the question, see what the examiner is asking you to write about, so that when you do go back to the extract, you are actually doing an informed reading of that extract. You know what you're looking for. So here you can see the paper, and I'm just going to scroll down to the question itself. And remember, question 3 is the language and structure question. So as this is a paper 1, they will give you a very, very short section of the extract to look at. In paper 2, the language and structure, the non-fiction paper, the language and structure question on paper 2 is worth 15 marks, and they will be asking you to comment on the language and structure in the whole text. But here, as it's only 6 marks, they restrict the questions, the lines that you need to look at. So I always advise my students to read the question 3 times to be really, really clear about what it's asking you to do, and to underline or highlight the key words. So that's what I'm going to do now. So we've got the fact that it's focusing on lines 18 to 44. In lines 18 to 44, how, I'm going to highlight that because this is a how question, so I know I need to talk about language, structure and use technique. So how does the writer use language and structure, just in case we've forgotten, to show the change in both Podger's and Lord Arthur's moods? Now, that is the focus for this, and then of course we need to have supporting reference to the text. And just like in the literature exam where you are not allowed to bring the books in, reference to the text in the literature exam means you need to refer to an aspect. You don't necessarily need to learn a quotation word for word. Here you might refer to a particular section, a particular idea, rather than quoting, so it's deliberately kept quite vague. Now I'm just going to pause for a second and focus you back on these words here. How does the writer use language and structure? It doesn't say language or structure, you need to comment on both. And so you may be familiar with the mark scheme, so I'm just going to bring up the grid. This is a marking grid from one of the past papers, and you can see that for level 1 they put a section in bold saying that the mark awarded cannot progress beyond this point if only language or structure has been considered. So if you only write about the language choices but you don't make a structural comment, even if your language analysis is really good, you will not get more than 2 marks. And there is a similar restriction on the non-fiction paper if you only mention language or only mention structure but not both. So it's really important that you don't ignore that. So going back to our text here, we know that we need to be focusing on lines 18 to 44. Now I always advise you to, whenever they mention lines that you need to look at, I always advise you to text mark, either bracket along the side saying Q3, but as this is an online text, I'm just going to highlight this text in a different colour. I'm going to highlight it bright blue so that we can see that this is the only part of the text that we are allowed to take our information from for this answer. And so looking at the question, I know that in this section I need to talk about change in Podger's Lord Arthur's mood. That's what I'm looking for in this section. Alright? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a look through that, and you might want to now pause the video to read through that extract yourself so that you know what I'm looking at and what I'm talking about in this extract. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to base my plan around Podgers and Lord Arthur. You might be tempted when you're writing a language and structure answer to write a section on language and a section on structure and separate them completely. But when you think about our triangle here, when you're talking about, for example, a change in mood, which is a structural point, it will be the language that gives you a clue to the change in mood. So for the grade 9, 8, 7 and so on, for the higher grades, it's probably more sophisticated to try and incorporate the two of those elements together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very, very quick plan, and I'm going to model for you very, very quickly what I might want to talk about. So having read the extract, and I'm just going to scroll down, or scroll up rather, back to the extract that I've highlighted in blue text. So I'm going to talk about, actually, first of all, I want to talk about Lord Arthur. And I want to think about a structural point for him. In a minute, I'll come on to Podgers. So I'll put him over there. Now, I'm going to write my structural points in red. So looking through this extract, I think at the beginning, he starts off as being quite powerful and forceful. And then towards the end, I would say he's impatient. And I would say that there's a certain loss of control. Excuse my writing there. So there's a certain loss of control in Lord Arthur. When it comes to Podgers, however, at the beginning, he seems to be intimidated by Lord Arthur. He seems to be quite intimidated by Lord Arthur bossing him about, whereas towards the end, he's more powerful and he's more in control. So those are the structural points I want to make. So Lord Arthur starts off as powerful and then becomes impatient. Podgers starts off as intimidated and becomes more powerful and in control. Now obviously there is clear evidence in the language to support those structural points, and so I'm going to use my language analysis to prove the structural points I'm going to make. So for example, when we're thinking about Lord Arthur, I would look at line 23 where he says I insist, and that's a powerful verb. So you can see in blue I've got my language point there that I want to make. So towards the end I would say that he is losing control. You've got the verb where he stamps his foot angrily. So you've got the powerful verb, and I'm going to, sorry I haven't done the space properly there, but the adverb angrily. And I'm going to say that's an adverb. So I've got my language analysis and I've got my use of terminology in there already. I'm going to follow a similar pattern with Podgers. So at the beginning, he appears to be intimidated. And so you've got some adverbs here. So we've got the adverbs uneasily and nervously. Those are adverbs that all show his mood at the beginning of the text, or the extract from the text, let's just say. However, towards the end, he is much more powerful, much more in control. So he begins to bargain. Questioning, will he be paid in guineas? But also, later on, you've got the adverb carefully. So the more Lord Arthur gets angry and loses control, the more in control Podgers becomes. He takes his time. He cleans his magnifying glass. Down here you can see he drew his breast pocket, from his breast pocket, a small magnifying glass and wiped it carefully with his handkerchief. So Lord Arthur, impatient here, Podgers taking his time. He's got all the time in the world. It's almost as if he's taunting Lord Arthur. So it's a complete role reversal there. So I'm going to use my plan in order to write my answer. So when we were starting learning about how to write these language and structure questions, I suppose we may have used a very, very formulaic approach to this, where we use our keywords from the question and we address the question and say something like, if I were to scroll up and you can kind of follow the question as I formulate this sentence, you know, we may have said something like, in lines 18 to 44, the writer or Wilde uses language and structure to reflect the change in both Mr. Podgers and Lord Arthur's moods. And you can almost see that I've rewritten the question. However, this question is only worth 6 marks and you're under a lot of pressure of time. Strictly speaking, you need to get your answer written in 6 minutes or maybe 8 to 10 minutes tops, but no more than that. So simply rephrasing the question as your opening sentence could well be time taken that you can ill afford. So really it might be better to get straight into the answer. So I'm just going to write a few sentences of this, or I might even write the whole answer. So I'm going to say, at the beginning of this extract, comma, Wilde portrays Lord Arthur as being very confident in his position. In his position. His position as what? In his position, well, what is his position? Well, he's wealthy, so I'm going to begin a list and I'm going to almost use a rule of 3 here. Just because this is the fiction paper in my answer, I can use one of my techniques to improve the quality of my answer. So I'm going to say, at the beginning of this extract, Wilde portrays Lord Arthur as being very confident in his position. That's his social position, because he is a lord after all. His wealth and the power it gives him. Let me just pause for a second and reread. At the beginning of this extract, Wilde portrays Lord Arthur as being very confident in his position, his wealth and the power it gives him. Gives him, Gives him, yeah, that's okay. I'm actually going to elevate the sophistication of that. I'm going to say the power it affords him. Because it's almost as if he's granted that power simply because he's a lord and he's rich. And that's the only thing that makes him powerful. Now, I want to use one of my ideas. So I've said up here, I've used that idea. I want to now move on to my language analysis because I've made a structural point. So I'm going to move on to talk about how he insists. So this is emphasized. In the powerful verb I insist. But I'm also going to add to that because there is something else, another structural point that emphasizes his, he's almost intimidating Podgers here. So I want to talk about this section here. Let me just highlight it here. I will pay you, I will give you. Because that gives me an opportunity to use some of my terminology and make a structural point. So this is emphasized by the powerful verb I insist, followed by the anaphora, I will pay you, I will give you, and then I'll just do a bit of ellipsis to show that the sentence continues. So we've got something there about Lord Arthur's mood at the beginning of the extract, and we've got language analysis embedded within that and the subject terminology. However, I haven't mentioned Podgers yet, so I want to talk about Podgers. And as I'm talking about Podgers, I am actually going to move on to a new paragraph. So I'm going to say at this point, and a comma there, because it's a clause at the beginning of a sentence. Podgers, well, how is he? In our plan, we said he's intimidated. So I want to say he is intimidated. So at this point, Podgers, but at the end of the extract we're focusing on, he isn't intimidated at all. So was he intimidated or wasn't he? I'm going to say actually he appears to be intimidated. So at this point, Podgers appears to be intimidated by Lord Arthur. Now, I could put a full stop there and write, this is shown in the quotation and so on, but actually I haven't got time for clumsy, uneconomical sentence structures, so I'm just going to put another comment there and say, as suggested, by the adverbs. So notice my use of terminology there, and then I'm quoting the lexical choices, the language choices that prove my point. So uneasily and nervously. Okay, so I've said that he's intimidated, and I've talked about adverbs, uneasily, nervously. So I've covered the first half of my answer. I've talked about Lord Arthur at the beginning and Podgers at the beginning. Now I want to talk about how it changes, and that again is a structural point. So it may appear that's a short paragraph, but I did want that Podgers' point to be separated from the Lord Arthur point. And now I'm going to start a new paragraph because I am moving on to a new section of my answer. So, however, the balance of power begins to change. Now notice begins to change is a phrase that's a structural point. The balance of power begins to change. Now when does it begin to change? Well, it begins to change when Lord Arthur offers a cheque for £100, and I'm going to use that as an embedded quotation. So it's this last bit. I've actually highlighted the first section of it already because I made a point about that sentence earlier on when I was talking about anaphora. So, however, the balance of power begins to change when Lord Arthur offers, and then embedded quotation, a cheque for £100 for £100. Now, I want to, rather than go on and talk about how Lord Podgers changes here, I'm going to talk about the effect that offer had on Podgers. So, Podgers' business-like character and notice the possessive apostrophe for Podgers, because his name ends in an S, the possessive apostrophe goes after the S. In the exam paper itself, they've followed that rule and added a second S. So if in doubt, check the exam paper to make sure you get it right. Podgers' businesslike character takes over as hinted at, or no, yeah, as hinted at, his green eyes flashed. Is that phrase I want to look at, because this is the turning point there. The green eyes flashed. I might actually highlight that in green to show you that it's a turning point in the section. When that money is offered, suddenly Podgers becomes interested in actually doing as Lord Arthur wishes, because he sees some profit in it for himself. So Podgers' businesslike character takes over, and I'm going to say as suggested. I'd had thought I'd say as hinted at, but I think suggested is actually suggested okay, but I'm going to say as implied by, that's a bit better, is implied by the green eyes flashed. Okay, and that kind of makes the point that we've reached a turning point. But I want to also use my idea about this idea that he begins to bargain. So he begins to take control and he begins to bargain. So let's just double check that sentence. Podgers' businesslike character takes over as implied by the green eyes flashed, and this is confirmed. Green eyes flashed, implied by the green eyes flashed. I'm just going to say, and he begins to bargain. And colon there to show that what follows proves my point. Guineas? Question mark. Okay, so there we have the idea that the balance of power begins to change because Podgers his business-like attitude takes over and he begins to bargain with Lord Arthur. Okay. Now I want to say something about Lord Arthur. Lord Arthur, meanwhile, begins to lose control or seems less in control. As his impatience what else? As his impatience and yeah, he gets irritated, doesn't it? As his impatience and irritation take over. Okay, and then let's just go straight into, do I want a comma there or do I want a new sentence? I think I'm going to do a new sentence there and say this is evident. Another way of avoiding this shows or this is seen in, this is evident in the powerful verb stamping and the adverb, whoops, there we go, adverb angrily. Okay, so what we have in this from where I've written however is the second half of the answer. We've established how the mood is at the beginning and who's in control. Now we're moving on to the second half where the balance of power shifts. So however the balance of power begins to change when Lord Arthur offers a check. Podger's businesslike character takes over as implied by the green eyes flashed and he begins to bargain. Guineas. Lord Arthur meanwhile seems less in control as his impatience and irritation take over. This is evident in the powerful verb stamping and the adverb angrily. Okay, now I want to sum up at the end, so let me just get my new bit of paper because I've run out of space on this one. So I want to sum up about Podger's power at the end. So Podger's power over Lord Arthur is complete when, and I'm going to say something about his attitude there, because remember Lord Arthur's getting impatient. He stamps his foot. If I scroll up you'll see it's down here, and he shouts out, "Be quick, sir," cried Lord Arthur again, stamping his foot angrily on the polished floor. Podger's, his power is complete basically when he defies him and he just takes his time, and it's almost as if he's taunting Lord Arthur. So you can see from our plan we've actually mentioned that here because we've got the stamping and the angrily, and I just want to finish with this last point. The control and the power is seen in the adverb carefully. So Podger's power over Lord Arthur is complete when, and I want to add in a drop-in clause there saying in defiance of the noblemen's, because I don't want to call Lord Arthur a nobleman because I don't want to keep repeating Lord Arthur, Lord Arthur, Lord Arthur. So in defiance of the noblemen's imperative be quick, and notice I've got terminology there. He's giving orders, be quick. He's not asking him, he's telling him, be quick, sir. And then don't forget, if you're adding in a subordinate clause, comma, comma, either side of the subordinate clause. So Podger's power over Lord Arthur is complete when, comma, in defiance of the nobleman's imperative, be quick, sir, comma, he wipes his magnifying glass carefully. And there we have a very fully developed sentence that not only has a structural point, power being complete, but we've got some language analysis in the imperative and the quotation here. So I'm just going to sum up about this adverb and just say this adverb is it's almost mocking display, and I want to go back and sum up about power, so I'm going to say display of power and role reversal. And role reversal. Okay, so I think, looking at my plan, I've said everything that I wanted to say in my plan. I'm just going to review that with you now and just talk you through, using my red and blue annotation, talk you through how I have integrated language and structure analysis rather than separating them into discrete paragraphs. Now, of course, as I said before, this is more a top grade 7, 8 and 9 skill. This is how you need to be thinking about making your answer more fluent and less formulaic. So let's just evaluate then. So at the beginning of this extract, so that tells us a structural point because it's establishing the mood at the beginning. So Wilde portrays Lord Arthur as being very confident in his position, his wealth, and the power it affords him. This is emphasized in the powerful verb, and there's our language analysis I'm going to underline in blue. I insist, followed by the anaphora. Now that, yes, is terminology, but anaphora is a structural point. It's the repetition of a particular phrase. So I'm going to underline that in red. At this point, so again, we're locating an idea in terms of the structure at this point in the text. Podgers appears to be intimidated by Lord Arthur, as suggested by the adverbs, so there's our language analysis, with quotation, uneasily and nervously. Now we have a structural point, as I mentioned before. However, the balance of power begins to change. So we can see that we're getting the role reversal, and this is taking us back to the question which you will see here, the change in both Podgers and Lord Arthur's moods. It's directly addressing a key element of the question. So the balance of power begins to change when Lord Arthur offers a cheque for £100. So Lord Arthur, Podgers' business-like character takes over as implied by the green eyes flashed. So this idea of takes over again suggests the change. So the businesslike character takes over as implied by the green eyes flashed, and he begins to bargain. Guineas. Lord Arthur, meanwhile. Now meanwhile again is another phrase that locates the point you're making, the idea you're expressing, at a specific location in the text. So again, it is about what is going on at this point for Lord Arthur. So Lord Arthur, meanwhile, seems less in control. Now I'm saying that's a structural point because it shows how the mood is changing. And we say he's less in control as his impatience and irritation take over. This is evident in the powerful verb, so we've got a bit more language analysis. The powerful verb stamping and the adverb angrily. There's a bit more of our language analysis. And then the final point, Podgers' power over Lord Arthur is complete. So this shows the change and the fact that he's in defiance of the nobleman's imperative language point, imperative verb being chosen. He wipes his magnifying glass carefully. There's a language point again because we're quoting the adverb there as mentioned in the next section. And then final point, this adverb is an almost mocking display of power and role reversal. And it's this idea of role reversal shows us that you have addressed the issue of the change in Lord Arthur's mood. So hopefully, talking through that in a lot of detail, you think, how will I ever get something like that written in 6 minutes? It is possible. It takes practice, and that's the best form of revision. What I would suggest also is that you think about how I planned this, and think about how you might want to practice using some of the other papers that are available